Hello, everybody. My name is Shimitra Gonzalez. I'm the community organizer for the Louisiana Stop Solitary Coalition. We're a new coalition composed of solitary survivors, social justice, and faith groups dedicated to ending the use of solitary confinement in Louisiana prisons and in jails. Before we begin today's panel on the moral interpretive to end solitary confinement, I wanted to help viewers new to this issue understand what it means when I say solitary confinement. Solitary confinement is the practice of isolating incarcerated people in closed cells for most of the day. Most of the times, there's no human contact for long periods of time, ranging from days all the way down to decades. Research has documented that solitary confinement can inflict permanent psychological and neurological damage, and it can literally cause people to lose their mind. Instead of being a last-minute resort measure used temporarily for safety reasons, oftentimes, incarcerated people are placed in solitary confinement. In Louisiana, nearly 60% of all DOC prisoners are placed in solitary confinement systems for the vague reason of rule violation. Although it has become common practice in the U.S. correctional systems, the use of solitary confinement, also known as segregation or restricted housing, has never been shown to reduce violence. The United Nations has stated that solitary confinement in excess to 15 days often rises to the level of torture. Yet, a 2019 report by 3 different social justice organizations found that 77% of the people held in solitary confinement in Louisiana had been there for more than a year. The Vera Institute for Justice recently reported that our state uses solitary confinement at nearly 4 times the national rate. Solitary Watch reported in July that COVID-19 pandemic has led to an explosion in the use of solitary confinement, over 500% from the previous levels. I was alarmed by the reports that the LA prisons and jails are using solitary confinement to isolate COVID-infected people, and that LA correctional officers even reopened the notorious Camp J at Angola to do so. The purpose and goal of today's panel discussions are to articulate the moral arguments to oppose solitary confinement based on the teachings of several different faith traditions, and to explore how we can best engage faith communities in the struggle to end solitary confinement. Clearly, the moral authority of Louisiana's faith leaders and the spiritual and social capital of our faith communities are needed to address the tremendous immortality of prolonged social isolation in a state that is incarceration capital of the world. For these reasons, we welcome you to today's panel's discussion. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our moderator of today's event, Rabbi Katie Bauman.
My name is Rabbi Katie Bauman. I'm the senior rabbi of Touro Synagogue in New Orleans, and it is a tremendous honor for me to be here today amongst this incredible panel of inspirational moral leaders. I'm honored to sit among you and to moderate today and to ask each of you questions, to draw out from you the wisdom of your experience and the power of your words. Obviously, as a rabbi, I come from a Jewish tradition, and it is clear to me when I look at our tradition, at my religious tradition, that the precept that each of us is created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God, is an overarching principle that really should inform the way we behave, the way we interact with every single person. And when I look at our biblical texts more broadly, I see and hear the call of the prophets that emphasize God's insistence that society's treatment of its most vulnerable citizens, vulnerable for any number of reasons, that is the barometer by which its overall character is measured. I think of the words of the Psalms, in which David cries out from a narrow place and God listens. Min hametzar karatiya anani b'merchavya. I cry out from a narrow place and God hears me there. God doesn't want me to remain in that place. And I think especially in these high holy days that I'm observing of the words of Jonah, which is that Jonah cries out from the belly of the whale, and God does not leave him in that place, no matter what his mistakes may have been. So with that as informing my presence here today. It is my honor to now introduce you to this outstanding panel. We'll begin with Mr. Woodfox.
Hello, my name is Albert Woodfox. Unfortunately, I have the distinction of being the longest held individual in solitary confinement in Louisiana and probably the United States. I'm not sure about, outside of America. Since I've been released, I've written a book called Solitary, which tries to explain to the reading public what the horror of solitary confinement, the destructive nature of it. And I've been a social activist for the last 50 years of my life, and being in society has given me an opportunity to continue to do work in that capacity.
Ms. Consuela Gaines.
I spent 22 years in prison. I'm a survivor of solitary confinement of over 2 years. And right now I am a community organizer with the Lafayette chapter of Voice of the Experience, better known as VOTE, which is a nonprofit organization that was formed by and for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated individuals. We're constantly fighting to improve conditions and policies that affect those who are currently incarcerated. Having experienced solitary confinement myself for those years, I know that it's wrong and that it doesn't contribute in any way to punishment. It doesn't help, and that spiritually it can destroy a person.
Reverend Dan Krutz.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dan Krutz. I'm a native of Arkansas, but I've spent most of my life in Louisiana and enjoy all the things that Louisianans enjoy. While I was in seminary, part of my education had to do with visiting correctional centers, and I think that's where I got my first taste for the sense of calling to help people who are behind bars and are incarcerated. Throughout my ministry as a pastor for around 20 years, I often visited the jails and correctional centers, and I think it had widened my view about this ministry and about the people who are behind bars. And more recently, in my work in the Louisiana Interchurch Conference, being very much involved in advocacy efforts to reform criminal justice in Louisiana. Thank you.
Bishop Shelton Fabre.
My name is Shelton Fabre. I serve as the Catholic Bishop of the Diocese of Houma-Thibodaux in Louisiana. I also serve as chair of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops Ad Hoc Committee Against Racism, which the bishops of this country established after the events of Charlottesville, Virginia. We also put out a pastoral letter in 2018 against racism, Open Wide Our Hearts. And in that letter, we mentioned that some aspects of criminal justice are racist, and I am an advocate for criminal justice reform on many levels, one being solitary confinement. So I'm very happy to be here to share some Catholic perspectives about our desire to end solitary confinement in Louisiana.
Mr. Ben Wortham.
Ben Wortham, I'm Senior Director of Health Integration for Catholic Charities USA in Alexandria in the DC area. I started this position about a year and a half ago. For the 7 years prior, I worked at Catholic Charities New Orleans, working on a team where we were in healthcare and homeless housing. And so quite literally, we would walk the streets and enroll patients who were recently out of prison. And I saw just the health conditions and everything that went into that. And that's the angle that I'm coming from today. Good to be here.
Reverend Ron Stief.
I'm Ron Stief. I'm the Executive Director of the National Religious Campaign Against Torture. I am a United Church of Christ minister, and we're a campaign of about 300 faith organizations. We're interfaith from across the country, some national, some regional, some local. And I know there's some things that many of us across the faiths and within the Christian community disagree on, but there's one thing that we all do agree on, and that's the basis of our work. It's that torture is immoral, torture is wrong, and should never be used by one human being over another in God's world for any purpose.
In your award-winning book, Solitary, Unbroken, by 4 Decades in Solitary Confinement, my story of transformation and hope, which I know is affecting people deeply as they read it, you often spoke of how you drew upon the morals, principles, and values of the Black Panther Party and the love and support of your ancestors to sustain and support your struggle. Would you discuss those morals, principles, and values that sustained you and possibly also serve as a moral compass for the Louisiana Stop Solitary Coalition's campaign to end solitary confinement in our state? Mr. Woodfox.
Well, what I meant by, the party, the Black Panther Party, through its 10-point program, gave me my life direction. Up until that point, I was like pretty much socially dead. I had no connection to humanity. I had no regards for humanity. And so the party, first of all, I was amazed that they accepted me as a member, even though I was incarcerated at that time. And so that gave me the opportunity to practice, put into practice things that I had felt most of my life, but didn't understand and didn't know how to express those things. As far as drawing upon, when I say I draw upon the ancestors, it just meant as I learned more about the history of African Americans and humanity as a whole, I remember the sacrifices, the ultimate sacrifice, the survival of all the horrors that were inflicted upon the African Americans from 1619 to present time now. So it was those sacrifices, those indomitable spirits, I guess you can say, that guided me. And whenever I was confused or just tired of what was going on, I would always go back and read some part of a history book or something and remember what the ancestors did, their sacrifices. And that would inspire me to continue to struggle, even though I may have thought that, what I was doing or what I was trying to do was not effective. And somewhere in that, period, I developed an unbelievable love for humanity and realized that that I had been denied the right to be a part of humanity by the racist, economic, political, and social systems in this country. And that it were those institutions that shaped me into being a petty criminal, and seeing that as the only way I could survive and contribute. I continue, as I said, I continue to be a social activist. I continue to do whatever I can to help humanity move forward. Right now, that's where I find myself. My personal motivation, I have 4 beautiful great grandkids, and I would hate to see them fighting the same battle we are fighting now, 30 years from now. And so I'm trying to leave a better world for not only my grandkids, but all the grandkids out there in the world.
Ms. Gaines, could you tell us what role your Muslim faith played in sustaining you through 22 years of prison and successful reentry and your work as a community organizer now?
It truly sustained me in more ways than one, because I had some really, really hard times while I was on solitary confinement. I can remember like yesterday, there were moments that I had suicidal thoughts. It really played on me mentally. There were moments that I really struggled with my faith. I questioned God a lot. I struggled for a long time, and I can even recall being denied the right to practice and study of my Islamic faith while I was incarcerated. I had the prison chaplain tell me, just no, he wouldn't bring me a Quran. He wouldn't bring me any Islamic reading material. He refused. He even said that, you know, he would have to check to see in records department if I was in fact Muslim. And it's still to this day on my rap sheet from day one that I'm a Black Muslim. And he refused to provide the reading materials that I requested from the chapel. And it was hard. It was a struggle, not only mentally and physically, but spiritually with my faith. But the thing about Islam, in the Quran, it teaches us to stand out firmly for justice, as witnesses to God, even against yourselves or your parents or your kin, or whether it be against rich or poor. We're taught that. And I still stand firmly on those beliefs. And I know that Islam teaches us basic rights are a necessity for human beings, and to be deprived of being able to be around other human beings, that's not normal. That's cruel. That is not what God created us to or created us to exist that way. He created us to be able to interact with other human beings. And when someone is deprived of that, it can have so many different emotional effects, spiritual effects, mental effects on us. And that is why I feel so strongly against the use of solitary confinement.
Reverend Krutz, could you please tell us about the work of the Louisiana Interchurch Conference and the unanimous resolution passed at the Louisiana Interchurch Conference Annual Assembly in March of 2019, which called for the legislators in the Department of Corrections to reform the use of solitary confinement in Louisiana prisons and jails?
I'd be glad to address that with you. The Louisiana Interchurch Conference is a mouthful. We call it the LIC. Was formed in 1970. There are about 15 different Christian groups. We're part of the Christian tradition, but we certainly reach out to people of other faith and of goodwill in seeking justice and mercy in our society. There are kind of two aims of the Interchurch Conference. One is kind of a visible sense of unity. In our world, there's so many divisions, and part of those divisions are in the faith communities, and so to overcome those divisions. But the other stream or focus is around social and racial justice and so on, and that's the area I think that we're addressing today. There are about 25 other organizations like this around the country. Our mission, in short, is to live the faith we hold in common, and part of that faith, of course, is witness, and it's witness to social and racial justice and other issues. That's an expression, I think, of what we do. From its beginnings, the conference has been involved in criminal justice reform from the very earliest days, having to do with trying to lift up the violence at Angola Penitentiary back in the 60s and the 70s. And then it helped to create the first, I think, inmate-run radio station at Angola Penitentiary. I think in other ways, we have passed resolutions to end the death penalty, and we're still advocating for that. And I think that the resolution about ending capital punishment, or excuse me, capital solitary confinement, ending solitary confinement is sort of another public policy and advocacy effort that we are making. We are actively doing advocacy at the legislature here in Baton Rouge and trying to involve more and more people of faith in this work and endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Wortham, would you talk about your experience with health guardians at Catholic Charities Archdiocese of New Orleans and in dealing with the health needs of those who were recently released from incarceration? And could you talk a little bit about how that would be exacerbated with COVID-19?
Yep. So I worked at Catholic Charities New Orleans in a program called Health Guardians for 7 years, up until a year ago. When I left, 80% of the program and the clients that we enrolled were homeless, and 50% of them had, when we started diving into the data, had been in prison at some point. And we found these individuals on the street or in the emergency room because they were using the emergency room services for uncontrolled chronic conditions and often had co-occurring mental illness that went along with it. So we would sit down, we'd do a care plan with them, and really try to link them into the healthcare system as quickly as we could. And that was usually the first 3 months. And then from a year to 2 years of working with these individuals, we'd work on everything with reintegration, trying to get them housing, education, employment, if that was possible. But let me say the kicker. The kicker is that there was not enough mental health treatment out there. So we would try to refer them to psychiatrists in New Orleans. And as many of you know, there's not enough psychiatrists in New Orleans who accept Medicaid. So it was pretty normal after we would enroll someone and we were making good progress with their reintegration that they would go MIA for 3 months, 5 months, 6 months, a year possibly, and then pop back up on our map. So, and that had to do with the underlying mental illness that was causing that. And so as if reintegration wasn't hard enough for these individuals with healthcare, housing, education, we're now throwing on top of them in prison something that's going to stunt them even more and only exacerbate poor health and mental conditions. And so which is solitary confinement. And so I received my boss, Dr. Rigamer in New Orleans, who's a psychiatrist in New Orleans. He sent me a study, and I quote, "A growing body of literature shows that solitary confinement can change brain activity and result in symptomology within 7 days." So you're talking about placing someone in solitary confinement for COVID, but after 7 days, we have studies now that show negative effects of the brain. So we're all trying for reintegration, and instead of positive reintegration, we're setting people back steps by putting them in solitary confinement. We're decreasing their odds of being able to adapt by putting them in solitary confinement. And as that study showed, that can happen even after 7 days of solitary confinement. Thank you.
Thank you. And having heard about Mr. Wortham's work at Catholic Charities, I wonder, Bishop Fabre, if you would share with us a bit more about what Catholic social teaching is and which principles and values of Catholic social teachings are most relevant to the moral arguments to end solitary confinement, the effects of which we've just heard about in practicality.
Certainly. The Catholic Church's social teaching is a rich treasure of wisdom that calls each person to build a just society. And as we attempt to do that, there are 7 general guiding principles that we must always remember. Those 7 principles are the life and dignity of the human person, a call to family, community, and participation. Number 3, rights and responsibilities. Number 4, option for the poor and vulnerable. Number 5, the dignity of work and the rights of workers. Number 6, solidarity. Number 7, care for God's creation. So the principles, the 7 principles, the ones that I believe relate directly to ending solitary confinement are obviously the life and dignity of the human person and solidarity. The life and dignity of a human person is very easy to understand. In a speech in 2014 to the delegates to the International Association of Penal Law, Pope Francis decried extreme forms of isolation, which Pope Francis actually called torture in high security prisons. Solitary confinement does not respect the human life and dignity of the person because of the mental and physical suffering which have been mentioned, which it brings upon those who endure solitary confinement. Solidarity is the next principle I think is very important. Pope John Paul II stated, and I quote, "Solidarity is not a feeling of vague compassion or shallow distress at the misfortunes of others. On the contrary, solidarity is a firm and persevering determination to commit one's self to the good of all and of each individual because we are really responsible for all," end quote. So solitary confinement is detrimental to the life and dignity of each person, which is one of the guiding principles of Catholic social teaching. And now that we know that, we cannot simply sit around and do nothing. Solidarity calls us to do something about it. So those two principles, the life and dignity of the person and solidarity, directly feed into this desire for us to end solitary confinement. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope we're beginning to be able to stitch together a story here today, whether or not this is an issue familiar to you or a new one. The way that our religious and moral teachings go hand in hand with the best practices that we have as a community for helping people to re-enter and remain whole. Reverend Stief, would you please tell us about the work of the National Religious Campaign Against Torture to End Solitary Confinement in the U.S. and its resources for faith communities to engage in the movement for restorative alternatives to solitary confinement that prioritize rehabilitation and therapeutic interventions and recovery?
Yeah, and to build on Bishop Fabre's note about taking it out into the streets, that's essentially what our coalition decided to do. Not enough people knew that this was happening inside our prisons and still don't. But 10, 15 years ago, it was almost hidden from view. And so we produced a film that's called Breaking Down the Box. The box is another word for solitary confinement that went out and was shown in mosques, in synagogues, in congregations around the country. And we got a lot of people involved, and they're part of what is now almost 15 state campaigns that are working at a state level across the country. Red states, blue states, it doesn't matter. The people are starting to realize that this is a practice that needs to end. But that wasn't enough. So one Easter season, we built a church, actually, during the Easter season, built a solitary confinement cell through the time leading up to Easter. And we took that solitary confinement cell and toured it across the country, and there have been other replicas of solitary confinement cells built since then that have shown up in state legislatures. We've been at tens of thousands of people have seen it at religious conferences. And basically what we're trying to do is give people an experience that no one should have. And I will tell you that having been at many of these conferences, people might go in thinking, oh, it's going to be quiet in there. I could get a lot of reading done. I mean, people just don't know what happens in solitary. And I have yet to see one person walk out of that solitary confinement cell. And we also have a virtual reality program because we can't just put this cell on a 15-foot truck everywhere, which has also gone across the country. I have yet to see one person walk away from that without saying, my God, I had no idea this is what we were doing to people inside our prisons. I can see why they call it torture, and we need to stop it. I mean, it is just that blunt. And so we have resources on our website. There's the film and the educational resources that you can have congregational discussions. I want to end it with a quote from somebody that we respect a lot. Like I said, we're a national organization. We worked very closely with Republican Senator John McCain through the years to try to get prohibitions against torture in the CIA and in our own military. And I mean, believe it or not, we as a nation have decided to treat detainees from the theater of war better than we do our own people inside our prisons. And Senator McCain came up during a Senate debate and he lifted up why he, a POW and torture survivor himself from the Vietnam War, was so opposed to torture. He said, this idea that we should never torture another human being is, quote, an idea that all are endowed by the Creator with inalienable rights. How much safer, he asked, the world would be if all nations believed the same. How much more dangerous it can become when we forget it ourselves, even momentarily. So I'd like to end with that quote because I have a lot of respect for Senator McCain and the work that he's done on this issue.
Thank you. Mr. Woodfox, we'll come back to you for this next round. In your view, from your unfortunate and powerful perspective, what is the most immoral aspect of solitary confinement and the most important reason it must end?
The most immoral aspect of it is anti-humanity. It serves no penological purpose. The sole purpose of solitary confinement is to destroy whatever prisoner may be put in there. For some of the most simplest thing is not being, rebelling against being treated a certain way or being talked to a certain way. And it can result in people being held in for decades. Its sole purpose is to break the human spirit and to destroy individual integrity, self-respect. It attacks the moral fiber of the human being. And so what the purpose other than to torture an individual for a perceived rule violation. It's a horrible, horrible thing, you know. I mean, I unfortunately, I spent 44 years and 10 months in solitary confinement. And, while, I was able to survive it and grow as a human being, it doesn't mean that I am free of the horrors. I mean, I even now, I still have a claustrophobic attacks, and I still wake up sometime and I'm disoriented, in which I'm not aware of where I'm at. So that's torture on any name or whatever, and it needs to end. It is immoral. It is inhumane, and and I would like to address, some of the things we said. I've been talking about. There was a time when the use of solitary confinement, you had to violate some rule, and that's not the case now. You have a prison system now, and they started in Angola prior to my release, in which just being sent to prison, you could be placed in solitary confinement as a housing assignment rather than, a punishment for some ruling infraction. And a lot of the prisons that's being built today in the prison industrial complex, they are built toward that goal. And it's not a penological purpose. It is an economic service. If you can take one man and control 30 men by keeping them in a cell 23 hours a day, then that's more profit for those who invest in private prisons. And so, for these reasons and all the reasons we've heard already, we need to end solitary. I know we can't end it immediately, but we need to start programs that phases the use of solitary confinement out of the prison system in America and around the world.
Thank you. Ms. Gaines, why do you think Louisiana communities of faith should become engaged in efforts to end the use of this prolonged social isolation in our prisons and jails?
I think that the communities of faith should come together because they hold such influence. Here in Louisiana, for instance, there's practically a church of some sort, masjids throughout the state, where people go to worship, and people turn to spirituality for so many different reasons. And when you bring together people of all faiths in an effort to destroy or to change a practice that has been used for so long, and it has no, it really hasn't, it doesn't have a positive effect on it. And when people start to realize that and talk about that, that is when it can, and something can happen. That is when things can change. And your spiritual communities, your religious communities have great influence on just about everyone in our communities. And, you know, the object of criminal justice system is to make society safer. And everyone wants to live safe. However, we don't make society safe when we constantly subject people to solitary confinement. So once people began to understand or even realize that solitary is being used for so-called punishment, and if it's coming to them and being brought to them by their spiritual leaders who are explaining to them the harms of it, I think that is the way to start, you know, having these conversations. You know, our governors, our senators, our legislators are very spiritual people, you know, and coming from that moral aspect, getting rid of solitary confinement, that discussion, you know, once we have that discussion about it on a spiritual level, everyone will see how wrong it is, how harmful it is to individuals. It doesn't help. It doesn't make those individuals any better than they were when they went in. In most instances, they're worse off. And like I said, we want to have a safe society, but by subjecting people to that solitary confinement, how much safer will society be if the prison systems are using that on a regular basis, and then eventually those same individuals are released back into society and they haven't been evaluated for different mental illnesses that they probably got while they were in solitary confinement. And it doesn't make the world safer by practicing this solitary confinement. It does way more harm than good on the individuals, and it does way more harm than good on society. And that's what people need to realize and understand first and foremost about solitary confinement. It's detrimental to a person's health, mentally, physically, and spiritually. And when people learn how to make those connections, I think that's when people will really understand that it's not a practice that needs to be continued. It's something that should be done away with is something that should be barred from using while a person is incarcerated. And there are other ways of punishment in prison. There are different things that can be taken away from a person, but caging a person isn't the answer. It's not the answer to most, like Mr. Woodfox said, people are subjected to solitary confinement for the least of things, very petty so-called crimes against the institution. And so it makes no sense really to be able to use solitary confinement. And therefore, that's why I know if the faith-based communities were able to come together and to be a voice and to speak up for those in solitary confinement, I see it like Mr. Woodfox says, it may not happen overnight, but eventually there can be a slowly stopping the use of solitary confinement, especially when there are other ways to handle a person if they've, had some type of violation, broke some type of rule of the institution.
Thank you. As we're speaking now tactically about what we can do, Reverend Krutz, now that the leadership of the LIC has strongly endorsed efforts to limit prolonged isolation in Louisiana prisons and jails and to invest in humane and effective alternatives to solitary, how can this Louisiana Stop Solitary Coalition best engage LIC churches and congregations in a grassroots campaign that we've been talking about to end solitary confinement in Louisiana?
Thank you, Rabbi Katie, and I have about 3 points to make regarding that, and trying to answer Consuela Gaines, Ms. Gaines, how do we become a better voice or a more effective voice in the faith community? I think number one, there are educational experiences and exposure to the campaign. Many church members are like other citizens, and they don't really have much of a knowledge, I think, or experience around the criminal justice system. And those, of course, those faith communities that do have prison ministries and do interact with incarcerated people, I think are really a good group to target in terms of working in this campaign. And I think outreach maybe to institutional chaplains and others with specialized ministries could be of help as well. We still need education that can take people beyond simply a simple understanding of people in prisons as to be punished. I think the role of rehabilitation is not fully appreciated by the general population. Restorative justice is a concept and an approach to restoring the incarcerated into a full participation in society. And we really need this message, I think, to get out. Number two, I think having access to formerly incarcerated persons who've had experiences of solitary, just as we witnessed to today with Mr. Woodfox and Ms. Gaines, telling their stories, I think, can be transformative. For many, to get to know a formerly incarcerated person as a human being and as a child of God, just like everyone else, I think can be an experience of conversion. In a way, I think we need societal conversion on this experience and this issue. The third point is to engage each other on the moral imperative with urgency and as a kind of a continuing teaching moment. To me, or for me, there's a kind of a moral amnesia that has become a pandemic in our country. We need to raise up this alarm. Again, people are ignoring or forgetting even the simple rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Though I've not read his work, I have learned in some research for this day, in his novel, The Stranger, Albert Camus suggests that the way society treats its prisoners reveals the degree of its morality. We need to help people to see it's not those who are punished with solitary confinement who should be ashamed, but rather the reality of those at whose hands this unjust and inhumane practice debases all of us. There's a better way. Thank you.
Thank you. Bishop Fabre, In your role as the chair of the Anti-Racism Committee for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, can you address the intersection of race and the disproportionate number of people of color who are both incarcerated and who are held in solitary confinement?
Sure, certainly. The disproportionate number of people of color who are in prison is a direct outgrowth of the sin and evil of racism. In our pastoral letter issued in 2018, Open Wide Our Hearts, the Catholic bishops of this country state, and I quote, "In our prisons, the number of inmates of color, notably those who are brown and black, is grossly disproportionate," end quote. There are many studies that prove this fact to be true. Among them, research from the Pew Center, which in May of 2020 stated, and I quote, "The racial and ethnic makeup of U.S. prisons continues to look substantially different from the demographics of our country as a whole. In 2018, Black Americans represented 33% of the sentenced prison population, nearly triple their 12% share of the U.S. adult population. Whites accounted for 30% of prisoners, about half their 63% share of the adult population. Hispanics accounted for 23% of inmates, compared with 16% of the adult population," end quote. So studies also clearly show that the largest part of the disparity I just mentioned is because of racism and other problems in our criminal justice system that render harsher sentences for people of color. So when the gateway to prison is skewed because of racism to incarcerating people of color, it should not surprise us at all that this same outlook probably prevails in the prison when it comes to placing inmates in solitary confinement. With inmates of color, because of racism, the objective can easily focus on punishment rather than rehabilitation, as has been said, and thus they would endure more situations of solitary confinement in punishment. So the evil and the sin of racism does play a role in the disproportionate number of people of color, not only who are in prison, but also those who are held in solitary confinement. Thank you.
Thank you. Striking figures. Reverend Stief. Oh, excuse me, Mr. Wortham, we'll start with you. You served as a Jesuit volunteer corps member and attended a Jesuit university, I believe. What values and principles of the Jesuit tradition could be applied to moral arguments to end solitary confinement?
Yep, thank you. So I did Jesuit Volunteer Corps, and the slogan is "Ruined for Life," and I would say that's definitely true with me, but that's in a good way. When you look at some of the pillars of the Jesuits, some that come to mind would be creating a more just, humane, and sustainable world, development of personal potential, calling forth the good person that is in every person, learning from experience, and special concern for the poor and oppressed. And I want to focus specifically on what I learned, which was the power of community. So I was sent down to Mobile, Alabama, and I worked in a community of people with severe developmental disabilities. And so half of us had severe developmental disabilities and half of us did not. And what I learned was that that community brought out these incredible gifts, not just in the people with severe developmental disabilities, but in also myself, I found, and the others without severe mental disabilities. Many of the clients, many of the what we called core members with severe mental disabilities had been locked away as young people in institutions before deinstitutionalization happened in 1967. So if I can relate that powerful experience of community being around people who were given no chance until this large cut community, it was called, it's that in solitary confinement, nobody has the opportunity for community, which we all know in reintegration, it not only helps the person who's coming out of prison, out of solitary confinement into society do better, but I know on a micro experience from my own experience, and I think you all know that it also helps you in society as a whole. And I just think that creating this nurturing community, if severely developmentally disabled people can show through their gifts and show us what they can do in communities, I think that we can do that more effectively for people coming out of prison, specifically solitary confinement, which shouldn't exist. Thank you.
Thank you. Reverend Stief, you can hopefully hear and feel there is energy in Louisiana to continue working on this and to work on it even more strongly. Are you aware of a successful statewide campaign to effectively engage faith communities in ending solitary confinement? And what advice would you give to the Louisiana Stop Solitary Confinement Coalition as it considers efforts to engage our faith communities in such a campaign?
Well, first of all, I just love the work that's being done by LIC and the Stop Solitary Coalition in Louisiana. And you've modeled, I think, one of our first principles is that when the moral voice of the faith community stands side by side with the voice of experience of those who have actually been in solitary confinement, it's pretty hard to lose. And I'm not saying we're going to win everything tomorrow, as Albert had mentioned, but it's hard to lose with that combination. And so at this point, as I mentioned, there are at least that I know of 15 other state campaigns similar to this that are happening around the country. There were, in 2019, there were about 28 states that introduced legislation to ban or restrict solitary confinement in some fashion. This wasn't happening a decade ago. In 2019, New Jersey took legislative action, and the governor signed that action to ban solitary confinement in all of its state facilities, its jails, and its detention centers. And now they're in the process, starting this August, of implementing that. There are 63 active pieces, or there were 63 active pieces in state legislatures of legislation that would limit solitary here in 2020. Some of these states that have passed this legislation, you've got Arkansas, you've got Georgia, Maryland, Montana, Nebraska, I just mentioned New Jersey, you've got New Mexico, Texas, Virginia, Washington. There is a national movement afoot that you are tapped into. And my belief is that it has to happen state by state with campaigns like what you're leading in order to get it to the point where what we call a tipping point, where not only the states that haven't come on board, but the federal government and its practices in the Federal Bureau of Prisons comes along and does what we're talking about right now, which is to ban the use of solitary and restrict solitary with the certain conditions. And I mentioned that this is not a conservative or liberal idea, and don't let anybody try to tell you that it is. We have strong allies. The Texas Public Policy Foundation, which is a conservative organization, works on this. The American Legislative Exchange Council, which recommends conservative legislations to its network around the country. We've been working there 3 consecutive years. I believe they're consecutive. They've passed directives to their states to give them ways to do study bills on solitary, to give them ways to evaluate exactly what we're talking about in the state legislative environment. So as a faith leader who's sat in on many meetings with probably more meetings than I can count with state legislators, I'll just say right up front, don't let anybody typecast this as an issue that belongs to any one political party or any one political group. It really does belong to us all. Start from there, take your witness in, and I think we're going to see this tipping point that we're talking about with your help and the help in so many other states. I think we're going to see that develop over the next 5 to 10 years, and we desperately need it.
Thank you very much. It is, they're considering the topic that we're discussing today, this issue, and severity of the consequences if we fail. There's such a tremendous amount of hope and skill and wisdom in our panel today. I'm sure that everybody who's watching can feel that and hopefully feel energized by that. It is my privilege and honor now to introduce our facilitator for the Louisiana Stop Solitary coalition. Vanessa Spinazola, would you please take us through and draw out even more wisdom from our amazing panelists?
Absolutely. Hello, everybody. My name is Vanessa, as Rabbi Katie mentioned. Just to introduce myself briefly, I'm the executive director of an organization called the Justice and Accountability Center of Louisiana. We are the backbone organization for the Louisiana Stop Solitary Coalition. We are honored to be so. The Stop Solitary Coalition started about 3 years ago in partnership with Vote, of which Consuela is an employee and strong advocate. And now we are nearly at 200 members across the state over just 3 years, which I'm incredibly proud of. We have an amazing coalition. We have several working groups now. We have, of course, a DOC working group, which is kind of what we started out of. We have a jail working group that has just started up, and now we have a faith working group. So for those watching and listening, if you are a person of faith and you are interested in drawing upon your faith to end this practice, we ask you to join us. We also coordinate with the immigrant and juvenile detention communities about issues that they see in solitary confinement in those institutions. A lot of times we kind of forget about those two areas, but we also have those centers in Louisiana as well. My work started in solitary when I actually, after Katrina, I got sick of the Katrina and I moved to Nevada and I worked for the ACLU in Nevada. And while I was there, solitary confinement was a large issue that we worked on. We found that 50% of the intakes that we got were actually prisoners experiencing solitary. So we developed a report, which in turn was basically the basis for the survey of the Louisiana lockdown report, which came out in June of 2020. It is a survey of over 700 people in Louisiana prisons. And if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to look at it. Every time I speak out in public and I hear from people in the prisons and jails who tell me that's not how it is. It's a little bit of political gaslighting, it feels like sometimes. I go back and I look at that report and I listen to Albert and I listen to Consuela and I try to remember that it's real, that these experiences are real. So I refer everyone to that report. And just in terms of the coalition, this past session, even though it was a crazy COVID session, the coalition did manage to pass legislation, Act 140. It bans the use of solitary for pregnant women in DOC prisons. It's the first time the law in Louisiana on solitary has been changed in 150 years, basically since the law was instituted. Right on Crime, Scott Payton, one of our partners, just issued a paper yesterday that goes over the history of solitary in Louisiana. I refer everybody to that. It's up on our social media feeds and it has information on the law in there. And then I'll just say we are working toward banning solitary for people with serious mental illnesses in the 2021 session. DOC has indicated they want to work with us on that, so we are looking forward to that. So with that, Reverend Ron and Bishop Fabre, and we'll start with Reverend Ron, if you could answer this question first. What spiritual guidance can we provide to prison and jail management and staff who may not see the use of solitary as a moral or faith issue, or they may struggle with the fact that under their circumstances, they don't feel like they have any other prison management tools at their disposal? What can we say to those folks?
I'm always amazed at how many meetings I can get with heads of state corrections and their staff when I'm part of an organization that has torture in its name. And I try to be very clear about the situation is one that we've all helped to create, and it's one that we all have to get out. And I do believe that more and more correctional administrators are, if not understanding this as torture, understanding this as Rick Ramish, the head of the whole state prison system in Colorado, once said, as he was shutting down solitary confinement himself with the governor through administrative action in the entire state. He said, it's only happening because it's what we've always done. And he says, otherwise it makes no sense, as we've heard on here. So I really do think that there is a spiritual lesson there that we can learn as human beings from our mistakes. I think correctional administrators are hearing what we're talking about. We're certainly in meetings. You said you have a committee. That's fantastic to be in dialogue with your folks. And I think we need to help each other get along to do the right thing. To me, that's kind of what a lot of our religious teachings all boil down to. And so, I mean, we're certainly committed to that. And I know you are too.
Thanks for that, Bishop Fabre. Would you like me to repeat the question or?
Yes, please.
Okay. What spiritual guidance can we provide to prison and jail management and staff who may not see the use of solitary as a moral or faith issue, or they may struggle with circumstances where they feel it is the only prison management tool at their disposal?
I think that, I think I'm always struck at what I don't know, or the problems that I sometimes see as insurmountable, until I ask someone else their thought, someone who might be out of the normal circle of my consultation, someone who may, because I think this is just insurmountable, there is no other answer, but to ask maybe someone outside of that circle, what do you think about this? And I'm always amazed at what people come back with. So because I think there is no other option, that does not mean that there is not. There is a solution to every problem. My challenge would be to remember that, we're all in this together, and we have to rely on one another and use the wisdom that God gives not only to me and my circle of consultors, but the wisdom that God also gives to others who might have an insight or a thought that we had never thought of. So I would simply say, be open to encountering through others a different perspective and something that might give you insight that you had not thought of before. So expand who is at the table looking at the answers to the problems would be one suggestion that I would make.
Great, thank you for that. All right, next question is for Father Dan. Father Dan, you are a consistent and persistent advocate at the Louisiana legislature. How can we convince other people of faith that involved in civic processes like the state legislature, whether you go in person or you speak privately with a legislator who's maybe at your church, how can we convince them that that is an important part of their faith?
Well, I guess the phrase faith in action comes to mind. Helping, so many times people of faith think that if they believe the right thing, that they've done the job. And I think we need to help people to see that that our faith really comes alive when we put it to work. And this area of criminal justice is I think, prime for that. I mean, when I think about my own tradition, there are a number of stories about people being in prison and being visited and cared for. And I think that's just reminding people that it's not just, or that it is a part of our heritage, I guess I would say, and that we need to live it out, you know, in the current moment in our lives, that this is a precious time for us to act. I hope that might be helpful.
Great, thank you. All right, Consuela and Albert. And Albert, we'll start with you. What spiritual advice can you give to the formerly incarcerated people that you work with about recognizing and dealing with the trauma of solitary and how they can work toward ending this practice for others?
Well, I think when you're working with someone who is in solitary confinement or who has been released from solitary confinement, what I've found most is people assume a lot about me. And I think the attitude should, when you're dealing with someone, especially housed in solitary or just being released from solitary, is not to assume anything, to get to know that individual, you know, and use his experience to raise your level of consciousness. I think the greatest threat right now, not only to solitary, but prison system and government institutions, is there's no oversight by American citizens, you know, which in times causes, as has been talked about, a lack of people really don't understand the horrors of solitary, what's being done in their name. And I think the movement to stop the use of solitary confinement is in its infancy stage, but it is a direct challenge to the Department of Corrections across this country, having set the narrative, set the tone as to, you know, so well, solitary confinement is not that bad. Only bad people go to solitary confinement, you know, and people are violent. What they don't understand is the thing about mental health issues is that it manifests itself in many ways. And if you don't have the level of conscience or training to recognize this, then a person who can be mentally ill will be written off as being violent or antisocial and stuff. So I think, it is incumbent on us to try to raise the level of consciousness of the American people around the world, to the horrors of solitary confinement, and try to start implementing programs that will phase the use of solitary confinement out of use in prison systems around the world, especially in America. I think we have a difficult task. One of the things I try to do, of course, a pandemic has, from its limited Robert and I being able to meet with people, is we try to make people understand that people in prison don't come from another planet. They come from families. And more often than not, families forget this. And they accept or embrace the narrative set by the Department of Correction as to how their loved ones, their sons, their brothers, daughters, nephews, cousins, or whatever, are being treated. And so we have to start challenging that narrative and show that there is a better way. That we don't have to lock people up in a cell 23 hours a day. And so I think that we have a monumental task ahead of us because the Department of Correction has been allowed to set the narrative for so long. I'm always reminded, of a Nelson Mandela or something I read, and it was inspiring to me. He says, when the cause is noble, you can carry the weight of the world on your shoulder. And this is what gave him, the internal strength and determination to do what he did. And from him, it gave me the internal strength to, redefine who I wanted to be as a human being and what kind of man I wanted to be. And so, we just have to keep, fighting for the conscience of the American public and remind people that, the immorality and the direct attack of solitary confinement on humanity. And I think if we can do that, eventually we will be able to eliminate the use of solitary confinement in prison systems.
Thank you, Mr. Woodfox. Consuela, would you like me to repeat the question for you?
Yes, please.
Okay. What spiritual advice can you give to the formerly incarcerated people you work with about recognizing and dealing with the trauma of solitary and how they can work toward ending this practice for others?
I think the advice that I could give is to hold on to their faith, because there's no faith that influences or teaches people to be evil towards another person, and that there is good in this world, and that we are the ones to be able to exemplify that good, regardless of what has been done to us. I also think that in some instances, it's good for people to seek mental help and be evaluated, because like we said, a lot of times people don't know the effects that solitary confinement can have on a person. And it's good to seek professional help. And also even spiritual. They can go to their ministers and talk about the effects that it had on them spiritually. Because as I said, it can be a struggle. It can be a struggle on someone's spirituality to be placed in solitary confinement for any length of time. And just to know that there are things like stop solitary confinement, people who are working towards ending it, and that they can participate. They can use their voice, their experiences of being in solitary confinement, testifying when the time comes in front of legislation, to end it, to end solitary confinement. So there are ways that people can be proactive coming out of solitary confinement and just staying connected with the organizations and faith-based groups who are working towards ending solitary confinement, and letting their voice ring out, and putting a face to solitary confinement, because a lot of people, they don't understand, or they don't quite get a visual effect of what solitary confinement is or what it can do to a person. So just so they know that there's help out here. There are people who care about people who've been through solitary confinement, and that we're here, we're willing to help in whatever way that we possibly can, so that you're not facing all these challenges alone.
Great. Thank you so much. We have concocted 6 different actions that you can take today to stop solitary. I do want to mention the first one of them. We have a petition that we've put together, and it is up on all of JAC's social media. The goal of this petition is we want to get to 1,000 signatures, and we want to deliver it to 4 people: the Louisiana Department of Health, the governor, the Louisiana Department of Corrections, and the Louisiana Association of Sheriffs. We have been struggling during this time to get media attention to this issue. We can't be in community with each other. So we envision that once we get to 1,000 signatures, we are physically, safely, maskedly going to go to those 4 different headquarter agencies and deliver this petition. And again, make an opportunity to have our voice heard in the media. So we encourage you to please go ahead and sign that petition online. If you are interested in the Stop Solitary Coalition, we have a large listserv where we routinely send out publications and other information. So, and the other actions will be listed also on our social media. We encourage you to take them. Thank you so much to our panelists. This was a really great discussion. I so appreciate all of your time and all of your hard work on this issue over the many years. And please take care of yourselves and be safe. Thank you so much.
Feel free to join us on October the 20th, 2020 for our first vision meeting. We are dealing with the moral imperative to end solitary confinement. We repeat, we would love to have you guys join us. Feel free to email Shemitria at jaglouisiana.org if you're interested.